Here we are at the Monetary Reform Conference. We're here with Joe and Will Abrams, who's from Vancouver Island in British Columbia.
I was born in 1928 and I've lived through a lot of history. 1928 was still good times. My parents were immigrants. We survived the Depression by living in the bush country then of northern Alberta. And experienced living literally off the land, picking the wild berries that were in the woods, fishing from the river and the lakes. We did find ourselves in the early 30s in a position, I know my dad did, that money seemed to disappear from circulation. In the 1930s, the volume of money that was floating around among the people in Canada at that time amounted to $4.91 per person. People had the products, but the money wasn't there. So
the people were willing to work.
Right.
The raw materials were there.
Right.
You actually lived through a time when the money supply
had diminished. Well, I looked at the Statistics Canada debt numbers, and it started in 1940. And it was about a $12 billion debt that the national government of Canada had. That level of debt did not change. It actually declined slightly, in spite of the fact that all the boys that came home were given the option of a grant to buy land and start a farm or to start a business. It was all financed by the Bank of Canada, which got created in 1935 to end the Depression, to finance public infrastructure. The major spending of the Bank of Canada really started when the war started. I know prior to the war, the unemployment was a problem, and we had to get people back to work. And the government did send dividends or checks to farmers if they employed somebody who was riding the rails at that time.
Right.
And my dad was given $20 a month for grading a road.
Yeah.
And that was direct from the government, and it was debt-free. Then when the war came, that's when the real spending began, and I know that we had to, looking back, we had to have spent billions of dollars to produce the third largest navy in the world. That doesn't, and that was wealth from workers, and no debt was created. Now, during those war years, of course, we began to look after social programs as well. A family allowance checks started coming to families. Universal health care came along in the late 50s. But when the soldiers all came back, they were all put to work to start out building the St. Lawrence Seaway. And we had to have a Trans-Canada Highway then too. We needed the airports to be built. And we gave that university tuition fees, vocational training fees, and Medicare was brought in the late 50s, and old age pensions were brought in.
The debt line stayed flat until the mid-70s, it looked like?
It was 1974. Simply because 1974, the national debt still only stood at a mere $18 billion. Then the graph simply took off, and within the next 15 years we were up to over $400 to $500 billion in debt.
Oh,
and
18 billion?
From 18 billion to 1993 it was 423 billion.
Oh,
and in the end of the 90s it was up over 500 billion.
What changed, Will?
The Bank of Canada gradually ceased to be the source of the money. They still went through the process of creating the bonds. The government would create the bond. The bond would be sold to the Bank of Canada, but the Bank of Canada, instead of printing the money and giving the money back to the government, passed that bond on to the private bankers, and the private banker gave the Bank of Canada the money, and the Bank of Canada gave the money then as debt money to the government. And from then on, the debt, of course, just began to climb phenomenally.
tell my dad about monetary reform. He says that sounds like socialism.
We use words to deceive ourselves, to box our thinking in so that we don't think for what is the right thing. We talk about right and left. No, we should talk about what's right and what's better, about right and wrong. Each one of us, human beings, are where the creation of wealth comes from. It does not come from a bank. It does not come from any money manipulation. It comes from us. If we make creative human beings, they will create. And if we give them a good sense of well-being, they will not commit crime.